So today's session is going to be around our Sound of the Next Generation report, which explored young people's relationship with music. Earlier this year, we surveyed 2,100 children and young people to better understand their relationship with music. We asked how they were accessing it and how it made them feel and what impact it had on their everyday lives. We then hosted interviews with young people, parents, and industry experts to help us interpret the findings. This was actually the first time that we've been able to do a research report involving all the young people across all ages that we work with. So it's been a really exciting one. It's also enabled us to compare results from our 2018 The Sound of the Next Generation reports and see how the music landscape for young people has changed over those 6 years. Before we go into some content from the report, we're going to do a little welcome activity. So we've got sort of 3 prompts here from findings of the report. And what I'm going to ask you to do is put your thoughts into the chat. So question 1, which activity did young people say was their favourite? Do we think it was playing sport, listening to, watching or making music, or gaming? So put your responses in the chat. Out of those 3, which one do you think it was? Actually see the chat. Can you see the chat?
Yes. Majority music coming through, few gaming.
Well, I'll put everyone out in their misery and surprise, surprise, it was listening to, watching, or making music. So yay for us. Question 2, since 2018, do children and young people think they have fewer or more opportunities? So fewer or more opportunities. What are we getting coming through?
It's almost overwhelmingly fewer.
Yes, I think none of us are surprised by that, but unfortunately it is fewer. And then question 3, true or false? Nearly half of early years parents surveyed think that nursery rhyme lyrics need updating. True or false, not all false. I think these words need updating as well as the lyrics, maybe. And what are we getting?
They're all coming through as true.
Correct. So 47% of parents felt that while the music itself was fine, that maybe the lyrics needed to be updated. So hopefully we've got a few more people in the room now, and we all enjoyed that thrilling welcome activity. And now I'm going to hand over to Remy, who's going to take us through some of the attitudes from the report.
Awesome, thank you, Sam. So as mentioned, this research kind of looked into the fundamental aspects of how music factors into young people's lives. So we're going to begin by delving into our top findings of their attitudes and opinions, so how they're feeling. Next slide, please. So the findings are clear. The vast majority of young people that we spoke to told us that music makes their world better, and almost 3/4 told us that music is a big part of who they are. So keep in mind that this is a nationally representative sample, so these findings aren't filtered by young people who are making music in some way or taking music lessons. This is very much reflective of the general population. And music is deeply important to young people as well. 2/3 feel like they couldn't live without it. And 70% say that music helps them feel connected to others, which reinforces, what we know to be the sort of vital social benefits of music making and listening. Further to all of those intrinsic values and really quite important in at times an isolating and sort of increasingly divisive global landscape. Next slide, please. So young people have told us about the various ways music is important to them, but they're not getting enough of it. More than half of young people we spoke to want more music in their lives. And on the whole, they're feeling less musical compared to our previous research in 2018. And we found that certain factors such as gender, location, and age exacerbate those disparities. And the biggest barriers to music for school-aged children and young people is access and cost. But for young adults and early career starters, they're telling us that it's time and ability that are the most impactful barriers. Next slide. And one of the most significant factors that we found that influenced musicality was actually geography, where young people are living. Young people in the north of England are less likely to identify as musical than those in the south. And furthermore, compared to 2018, the north of England has seen the biggest drop in young people identifying as musical too. So what we're seeing here is evidence of a kind of continuing imbalance. And by north, I'm referring to the regions of North East, North West, Yorkshire, West Midlands, and East Midlands. We also found that Wales is the only country in which the majority of young people that we surveyed don't feel musical. We see that figure improve slightly with England and Scotland, and we found that 2/3 of children and young people in Northern Ireland feel musical. Next slide, please. So owing to this being a sort of whistle-stop tour, so I do encourage you to kind of pour through the report in your own time. I'm just going to go through the top line findings. I'm just going to sort of touch on some of the other factors and characteristics that we found had a significant impact on young people's access to music. So class children from lower income backgrounds are less likely to identify as musical. Gender, so since 2018, there's been double the drop in girls and young women saying that they feel musical compared to boys and young men. And ethnicity, so young adults, 18 to 25-year-olds from the global majority, are less likely to think that they have the same opportunities as everyone else. So an interesting finding that we discovered in the realm of music making is the fall of traditional instruments compared to 2018 and the prominence, the sort of emergence of digital and electronic instruments. So we can see here that young people are 7 times more likely to be using a tablet or phone as a means to play or make music than a flute, for example. But interestingly, the piano and keyboard has remained as a popular instrument, but we have seen a marked decline in the use and presence of more traditional instruments. Over to you.
Thank you, Emmy. So, as well as looking into how young people are feeling in terms of musical and how they're creating music, the research also looked into how that they're consuming it on that kind of other side of music. So when asking young people how they consume music, consistent with 2018, listening through a phone or a tablet remained the most common way. So 75% said that in 2018 and 76% said that in 2024, so remaining quite consistent. But what we did see was a significant drop in the proportion of young people reporting that they listen to music through radio. In 2018, this was 64%, so the majority of young people saying that they're doing this, whereas in this report, that's dropped down to 41%. Interestingly, though, we did see an increase in people saying that they listen to music whilst traveling, up 37% from 2018, which is perhaps a reflection of the growth in the popularity of wireless earphones. When it comes to finding music, our survey sort of found this two-way relationship across generations, with 69% of 6 to 17-year-olds discovering music from their parents. Yet, interestingly, over 50% of parents of under 5 said that they find music from their child. So this relationship with finding is working both ways. Then outside of family sharing, a quarter of early years parents also reported their children liking songs from TV and film, which points to screens becoming the modern day music influence as opposed to physical formats. And this is something that we're also perhaps seeing with the older age groups. So 18 to 25-year-olds are more likely to find music through hearing or seeing it on social media than through their friends or family. And then similarly, more than half of them told us that they think music has to go viral to be successful. And this could potentially impact the future of music making. You can see this quote here from William, who's a futurist, saying how you have to look at how people are consuming now and create for that. This is then perhaps reflected in the fact that many in the survey believe that people will prefer bite-sized social media clips as opposed to full albums in the future. We have here a clip from Lucas, who was a young creative that was involved in the focus groups as part of the research. Also, the audio is really, really quiet, and I've tried to make it louder and unfortunately can't, but there are some captions on there as well. So hopefully you'll be able to hear, but if not, you'll be able to see the captions.
There's quite a stark sort of divide with how people find music, and I think a lot of that is dictated by class. Like when I go to Bradford, when I speak to a lot of my friends who maybe like didn't take a quote unquote academic route, didn't go to uni and all that, they find music through algorithms, through social media, through that sort of thing. But when I go back to Leeds, I speak to my friends who go to uni who, you know, they go to record shops, they go to local shows, and I think it's quite a clear difference between the two. But from a sort of artist perspective, it can be quite daunting, just, you know, knowing that you can put your all into art, and if you don't make a fun 5-second video to promote it, nobody's going to listen to it. Like an example I think of is Chapel Roan, who has just gotten absolutely huge lately, but she was dropped by Atlantic Records in 2021, I think, right after she released her song Pink Pony Club, which is a beautiful song about like queer awakening and community, but only just now, because her song Good Luck Babe went viral on TikTok, all of her work is getting all this appreciation, all this love, and it's like, as she should, you know, but it's quite, not sad, but quite sobering to know that like she's been at it for 10 years and it took a 5-second video for her to get that big, you know?
So some really interesting insight from a young person's perspective in how they view consumption habits within music and how that might affect the future of the music industry, which leads us on quite nicely to our next section.
Great. So, looking towards the future. Next slide, please. The young people we spoke to, you know, through this research, as we've just seen, are the future of the music industries, and they gave us some pretty clear indications of their expectations and ambitions for how music can factor into their lives. And one of the areas that we found the most exciting was the idea of genre and how relevant it is to young people in terms of how they find and ingest and indeed appreciate and make music. And we found that just over a third of respondents aged 11 to 25 felt that genres aren't actually relevant anymore. And in our interviews with Next Gen Creatives, they expressed the kind of benefits of labeling, but were also really passionate about kind of how categorization shouldn't feel limiting. And that music is kind of blending more and more each day in an increasingly sort of like globalized landscape. And that's a positive thing. And a quote from one of our interviewees, who's a young creative from South London, sums this up quite well. He said, I think it's good to know what the product is, but obviously, I think the whole idea is that you don't want to limit what your art is. You kind of want it to be like, no, this is just music, and this has got all of these different elements in it. And then he later went on to discuss music as a kind of dish with various ingredients that kind of enable the consumer to identify and appreciate different elements of music that inevitably broadens their taste too. Just deeply profound. Next slide, please. Young people are innovators and technology is embedded in their lives. So it's no surprise that digital forms of music making are growing. Just under half of musical preschoolers, so this is babies and young children aged 5 and below, are already making music on phones or tablets. And just under half again of young people think that most music in the future will be made by AI. But it's also important to mention that, you know, we're not hearing that the sort of traditional and digital cancel each other out. And I think highlighted by Ben here, a project leader at Mayhem Uprising and curator of Over the Digital Horizon, he mentioned, you know, digital versus acoustic is a false dichotomy. When you get to a certain depth of practice in either realm, it becomes clear that each can be used to support the other. Next slide, please. And for the other elements of music education that kind of need to keep up and evolve, the movement to decolonize the music curriculum we found is being called for very clearly from students and educators alike. And it's a crucial lens that we kind of must apply to music teaching to ensure that the next generation feel their culture is represented and all young people are equipped with the skills they need in an increasingly interconnected world. One of the individuals that we spoke to through our research was a futurist named William, who's had a decorated career across industries. And he said, so Western classical music has definitely got a place, but I think there's too much focus on that. Let's teach children more about global ethnic music cultures, show them how important it is to people's lives. Let's talk about all the different ways different people make and consume music. Let's show them all the different rhythms, scales, and instruments from around the world. Next slide, please, Sam. Thank you. And so take a look at young adults, early career starters who are looking to sustain a career in the music industries. How far are they informed and equipped to do so? So we found that less than half of 18 to 25-year-olds know what career paths are available in the industry beyond being an artist or performer. And just over half don't actually see lots of choices for jobs and careers in the music industry. And if you haven't already seen it, we ran an exchanging notes session last week on Industry Connect, which held a national consultation aimed at enhancing industry access and pathways for young creatives. And the recommendations from this research are really clear. The industries need to be better joined up through a national music strategy, need to reimagine curriculums and careers advice, need to enhance non-formal pathways programs, and they also crucially need to establish safer working cultures too. I'm going to hand over to Carol.
Yeah, so it's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour, and just I'm just going to very quickly talk you through a couple of the final findings, and then move on to what the recommendations of the report are before we all get a chance to kind of discuss and digest. And really, I'm kind of ending on some of the more kind of sobering findings that really feed into the recommendations. So the first thing was just around kind of the role of schools and what that means for children and young people's creativity. So we probably all know that there's been a massive decline in music GCSE and A-level entries. We know that music classes have been getting pushed out of the curriculum. The quote that you can see on screen there is from one of the young people that we interviewed, who basically kind of spoke about their one-to-one singing lessons that they felt were really, really important to them, but often got kind of pushed out because they weren't seen as a priority. And so it kind of, the findings are almost suggesting, yes, we know that music's kind of being pushed out, but like, is the school system itself really hindering children and young people's creativity? Because we found that at the ages of 16 and 17, that was when young people basically felt least musical. And obviously that's the time that they're taking their GCSEs. We just thought this was a really kind of sobering statistic. So you're probably aware that the Labour government's currently doing a curriculum review, and we're very hopeful that that's going to result in a broader and more inclusive curriculum, and we'll certainly be kind of feeding into that review when it comes out. The second thing that we wanted to highlight was really just really the importance of grassroots youth and community, which is a sector that's often overlooked and kind of undervalued when it comes to kind of policy and strategy. And obviously that's the sector that youth music is most familiar with, because that's the organisations that we're working with day in, day out. And really, what we've seen over the last few years is that these organisations have really been facing a bit of a perfect storm since COVID hit, really. So firstly, children and young people's needs since that time have been getting more complex, and there's increasing demand for their work. At the same time, prices are rising. We've seen inflation. People are needing to pay more in order to kind of, deal with the cost of living crisis. And then at the same time, funding is falling. So that's in kind of real terms, as people have less money to give, but also in kind of absolute terms as well. And youth music success rates at the moment for our funding are the lowest that they've ever been. So on average, we can only fund at the moment 17% of people that apply to us. So it's really kind of sobering. And we know that these organisations are doing really amazing work in very difficult circumstances, literally transforming young people's lives. And we really think it's time that they got the recognition and the funding that they deserve. Next slide. So just to then, I guess, move on to the recommendations, which align with the ones that Remy was just talking about through that we developed through Industry Connect as well. And what we're trying to do is just make sure that we've kind of got the same messages and we're kind of working on the same strategy when we're doing our sort of policy and influencing work. So the first one is around the government investing in a long-term strategy for growth that includes grassroots and youth and community music. So we're not the only ones calling for this, and actually UK Music in their manifesto had called for a long-term strategy for growth. Obviously, we've got the National Plan for Music Education, but we don't have an equivalent one for industry. And actually what we don't have is anything that sort of joins up the whole route from education into industry. So we think that there should be that strategy developed. And importantly, that when that is developed, that it includes the grassroots youth and community music who are doing such vital work with many children and young people. The second recommendation is really around reimagining the music curriculums, and this is kind of speaking to the sort of the need to decolonize. It's speaking to the need to be more children and young people led, and just generally kind of more accessible so that it can become more inclusive and reach a more diverse cohort of children and young people. It's also speaking to the point that music education as it currently stands isn't really preparing people for jobs in the modern day music industries. And so we're doing lots of work around this with our partners and other organisations in the DCMS as well. The final recommendation is just around industry sort of prioritising inclusion and safeguarding cultures. And those of us who work in music education will know that, safeguarding is really sort of part and parcel of the culture here already. And there's been a massive kind of increase in terms of the way that inclusion is prioritised over the last sort of 10 or 12 years. So that's been a big change really since the first national plan came into being in 2012. And it's really clear that now, if we're preparing people in music education and they're getting a certain type of education, then that inclusiveness should carry on into jobs into the music industry. So this kind of change that we've been on in education really now needs to happen in the music industries. And again, we'll be prioritising working with partner organisations across the industries to kind of really start driving more influencing around inclusion and safeguarding. So that is the end of the findings. Appreciate it's been a really whistle-stop tour. So I would recommend as well that if you haven't already, have a flick through the report, because we've tried to make it as accessible as possible for people. So it's quite a light read, I would say, but full of like interesting quotes and stats and all the rest of it. So what we thought we would do now is actually give you a chance to discuss some of the findings in breakout groups. And we've given you some questions there as well, just as a kind of start for 10. So what we'll do is we'll paste those findings into the chat. And if you would go into your breakout group and you can discuss one or all of those or just anything that's kind of spoken to you from what you've heard today. And what we would like you to do when you come back is just feedback, perhaps one or maybe two maximum, just sort of key points that came out of your group. So when you go into your group, you will need to elect someone to feedback. And we'll give you about 20 minutes for this. So we'll give you a 5-minute warning before the end, and then we'll bring everyone back and we'll have a quick chat together back in the room. So I'll just paste those questions in now. Welcome back, everyone.
Slowly filtering back in, yeah.
So if it was some deep conversations going on, that's usually a signifier of that, isn't it? To wrap things up.
Welcome back, everyone. Sorry to pull you away from, I'm sure, the amazing conversations that you were having, but we all want to hear about those amazing conversations. So we're gonna sort of like just do some quick feedback. So I'm gonna ask hopefully every group assign someone to feedback, and if you could just maybe think of like one, maybe two key findings from your group, and that just allows us to have time to hear from everyone. So I'm going to ask room 2, which was Caroline, Kate, Sophie, and Alex, to feedback first. Anyone from that group here?
Hello.
Hello.
We did have a really nice conversation. Maybe I'll just share some of it. If I can remember. I actually made notes, so that's good. We talked a lot about actually the definition of maybe what musical meant to young people and whether they're thinking if they're not actively creating, perhaps they don't deserve that label. So it's also about redefining maybe the limits or the not limits, the possibilities of what musical might mean, and how important validation from gatekeepers like teachers, your peers, and now social media are in helping people to think that they can be or should be musical. That was in response to question 1. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you, Sophie. We'll move on to room three, which is Danny, Tim, Fiona, Dan, and Shadrach.
Yeah, I can feedback on that. Um, yeah, interesting conversation, and I think the standard things about the EBAC having an impact on students being able to access courses in schools, and all the challenges with schools having to chase particular targets means that the formal music making kind of ends up getting pushed out. I think one of the things that we considered is the irony of students feeling less musical, because now there's so much more access to see since 2018 to seeing people being musicians and hearing people being musicians on Spotify and social TikTok, Instagram, and everything, that there are actually more opportunities for you looking at people being musicians going, I'm not that, therefore I'm not musical. So it's how you kind of, the irony of the victims of their own success, and then possibly wider access and everybody having access to learning a violin or a trumpet in for a year in primary school or a term. And if you engage with it, great. So you start to feel like you're a musician. But if you don't, you immediately go, well, I'm not a musician. And of course, all of this is in the context of the narrative about being a musician is about being a performance musician. And Shadrach was talking about what he does in his experience of being in school, but actually there are so many more facets of being a musician. And actually there's so many more facets of being a musician, even in the GCSE course. Solo performance is a maximum of 15%. The Western classical tradition is a maximum of 10%. But that's not the narrative that students hear, which is possibly having an impact. And actually coming on to the second question, digital tools and AI are really powerful tools that help students do things quicker. So, and I think it was Fiona made a really good point that AI is ubiquitous, and our role as working with children and young people is about helping students to learn. And if we can help them learn how to harness the tools that they've got to develop as musicians, then we're going to be in a good place. I hope that captures it.
That sounds really, really interesting conversation that your group had. Thank you so much, Dan. I'm going to move us on to room four, which was Anita, Dizelle, Evie, and Tiffany.
Hello. We had loads of technical difficulties, so there was only actually two of us who were able to join the discussion in our room, and one of them had to run off to a meeting, so you're stuck with me, I'm afraid. A lot of the same things came up in our group, and in particular with digital, we were saying that we have to move with it. We can't just ignore it, but it could be really useful for adaptive tech for our disabled pupils, but it could also be really good in just widening the offer for pupils who maybe don't fit into the traditional pathways. So alternative pathways into music, different types of music, different, approaches. The other thing that came up with us is about grassroots music community working together to amplify the importance. We talked a lot about how grassroots musicians and community musicians tend to have different approaches than music service musicians. So it offers our pupils, if we can get that collaboration right, it offers different outlooks. It just offers different, we can remove different barriers to maybe the music service. And if we can learn from each other, then it could be really, really magical for our pupils in terms of removing barriers to access and engagement.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And again, some more interesting points. Obviously, we've got some overlaps come from the groups, which is really interesting, but yes, some more insights. Thank you. Room five, Community Music Wales, Gail and Kate.
We didn't decide in our group who was going to feed back, did we? Something that we actually talked about a lot of similar things to what you've already talked about, including how do kids see themselves as musical children and young people? Is it influenced? It's interesting what you said before. I think it was Dan, about how the access to like music on social media is so easy now that it's easy to say, well, if I'm not doing this, then I mustn't be musical. And that idea of like how it's got, you don't know how much work they did in order to get there. You just see the final polished product. And I think that it's important for people to see the whole process. But something that we talked about actually that's not been mentioned yet was we were talking about collaborating with grassroots organisations. It's actually quite hard when we're all fighting over the same limited funding pot. And it's hard not to see it as this competitive thing. Actually, if we banded together a little bit, maybe it would be easier to access funding if we worked more in collaboration with each other to apply for that funding. But then we were also talking about how, well, local cafes don't band. Gail pointed out local cafes don't band together to be like, hey, we're all great. They compete with each other because someone's got better coffee or someone's got better cakes. So it's quite hard in our sector when everything has been, capitalism has done this. It's made everything a competition. How do we see beyond that and still collaborate with each other anyway? And could that be seen as a radical act? That's something we just mused on right at the end of our discussion as the breakout countdown was going on. We started thinking about that.
Really interesting food for thought there, and bigger conversation, and definitely come out of that. Thank you. And then our final room, which is room 6, which we have Kate, Kimberly, Ray, and you. Anyone from that group like to feedback?
We also didn't choose anyone to feedback, but perhaps we can feedback as a team. We only got through the first 2 questions. Such was how fruitful our conversation was. It was quite pessimistic in the first question, and I think unsurprisingly talked a lot about funding, but also post-COVID and navigating those issues, basically. And then we talked a little bit about technology and how it obviously facilitates accessibility in lots of different ways, including financially, and in terms of other learners. But we also talked about how it's not a silver bullet, and actually there are hidden costs and other accessibility issues involved in technology. And then we talked a little bit about AI and about how it can be used to facilitate more time for creativity. So using it for your more administrative processes to allow for creativity of young people. But I'm sure there's some other points that I've missed if anyone else wants to chime in.
Seems like you did a great job, Yusuf, but thank you very much. Amazing. Thank you so much for everyone for feeding back. I'm actually, before we finish up, we actually had a nice opportunity. There were quite a few youth music members of staff here today, and we were all in one group together while you were all in your breakout groups, and we found ourselves sort of discussing the findings. So I'm actually going to throw to my colleague Sprout, who's just going to sort of feedback on one of our thoughts from the research.
Hello. One thing that I think we found quite sad, to be honest, about the report, is just this narrative that seems to really be there, and that a lot of you have already spoken to, that young people, this idea that they have to go viral, or that they have to sort of market themselves in a particular way to be able to be successful, and this whole idea of success looking very much like one thing. For me, both as someone who works at Youth Music, but also as an artist who is really connected with a lot of grassroots organizations, I'm involved with a lot of community radio. It's not the reality that I actually see. I have a lot of friends that do make money and sustain careers off platforms like Bandcamp, and they have less than 100,000 streams maybe, but they've got core supporters who are real music lovers and want to support the artists and are passionate about the cause of artists having agency over what they do. And I think that there is a lot of that that's just not championed and not heard about. And when you go to music conferences or you sort of look at what narrative is pushed by the industry, a lot of the time it is this idea that you have to market yourself or be a brand, or how many streams have you got on Spotify, and I think you can see it in the way that people the young people are so disheartened to either
either actually refer to themselves as people that are musical, but also attempt to have any sort of like sustainability in their career or believe that it's possible. And like, I don't know, it's just something that I think, even from a personal level, I would just love to really change and champion and try and facilitate more spaces for there to be people who do go through those alternative routes to speak and have a platform and share that it's possible through different routes. And I think it's really clear from these findings that rhetoric isn't currently well known or talked about enough. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Sprout. Remy's just added in the finding from the report that kind of goes along with what Sprout was saying there. Well, just as like kind of finally, so I'd like to wrap up now. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming today and for participating. I think it's so hard to have these conversations on rather big topics in like a 20-minute breakout group. But I really encourage you to sort of like go away and continue to think about these conversations that you've been having. And go and have a look at the full SOM report. Like Karen mentioned, we've tried to make it as accessible and digestible as possible. So I really encourage you to have a look and continue these conversations in your own organizations, but with others as well. So enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you again for joining.